Hi, I'm your host, Jürgen Strauss from Innova.buzz, and I'm really excited to welcome today to the Innova.buzz podcast from Bethesda in Maryland, Carlos Alvarenga, who's an exceptional thinker and author and educator in the field of communications and rhetoric. Now, Carlos has traveled an extraordinary journey from his early beginnings as a refugee child to becoming a leading expert in persuasive communications, which is our topic today. He's currently in study towards his PhD in the field while teaching others about the art and science of persuasion. So, welcome to the Innova.buzz podcast, Carlos. It's a real privilege to have you here as my guest.
Jürgen, it's a pleasure to be here with your audience. Thank you for having me on your show.
Now, transitioning into the conversation today, I'm really excited to delve into your insights on persuasion and also following up on my reading of your book, and I'm part of the way through that, so I'm still working my way through the interesting bit, the one that I'm particularly fascinated about, using persuasion for evil and how we can kind of guard against that. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But
Sure.
before we into all things persuasion, which impacts everything that we do, really, every communication that we do, what's the impact you're aiming to make in the world, Carlos?
Persuasion is an interesting topic because it is something which is in the critical path of success in almost every field we can think of. And it's also a basic human need. I wrote the book because 3 years ago I was looking for a book on persuasion and I ordered some. And I found out they really weren't about persuasion. They were about influence or psychology or manipulation, negotiation. So I was looking for a book that just talked about this one word. And since I couldn't find a modern version, I went back to a very old book, which is the Rhetoric of Aristotle, which led to a project to ask some basic questions about what he had written, update his insight for a modern audience with modern examples. And the book came from there. So it was really a quest to answer a couple of important questions about this one word that led to the creation of this book.
Fascinating. So, your background is as a journalist. You started off as a journalist, and then you worked as a consultant for a long time. How did those experiences shape your understanding of persuasion, and how did they trigger that fascination, I guess, with the word?
Well, my consulting career was a little bit of a odd thing because I was an undergraduate classics major, so I studied Greek and Latin, did a post back
Okay,
in
yeah. Hence the
and
connection
so
to Aristotle.
right. So I was headed towards an academic classicist career, and then the Civil War in El Salvador, which is where I'm from, ended, and I hadn't been back to El Salvador since I was a kid. So I just couldn't resist the opportunity to return post-war and to see the country up close that I left as a child, and so I came back, or I went back, and I got a job as a journalist. Spent 3 years writing about the Reconstruction period, and then a friend of mine had become a consultant and said, "My boss wants to publish a book. He just doesn't want to write it. We're looking for a ghostwriter. Would you be interested?" And it paid better than my consulting job. And it's a chance to come back to my original job. So I came back to the US. I wrote this book. And at the end of the project, he said to me, "Hey, would you like a job in the firm?" And I thought of it as a temporary thing just until I kind of got my act together and went back to grad school. I ended up staying 20 plus years making partner and eventually worked as a partner at Ernst& Young and at Accenture. Left consulting a few years ago, went to work for a private CXO group for kind of an elite group for chief executives. Did that for a couple of years, decided that it was time to walk away from business and to go back to writing. And a few years ago, I sat down and became I would say, a professional student again. and the funny thing was that I sat down to write a novel. And by the way, the novel will come out later this year. But because writing can be a little bit lonely, I decided to volunteer with nonprofits. And in the US, there's a website that will match volunteers with nonprofits. And so I signed up. And the very first project I found was a gentleman who runs a phenomenal global disaster relief agency. And he was looking for help with public speaking. And no one had responded, maybe because he's kind of an imposing character. Imagine like a Henry Kissinger sort of profile. And I talked to him and I said, there are two issues. Issue one is that I've been around a lot of famous people who are public speakers, I mean, movie stars and heads of state in my job. They come in two flavors. There's sort of the classical musician, the Barack Obama, where you can put a prompter or a speech and we'll deliver it sort of pitch perfect every time. It's wonderful, like Yo-Yo Ma playing Bach, right?
Mm.
And then there is the jazz musician, the person who you give them a lead sheet and they're sort of improvising what's going on. The song is the same, but it's never quite the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't play the same way. So you're a jazz musician, so let's put Bach down for a while. But the other thing is, I'm not persuaded. I don't
Mm.
see what you want to believe. And that's when the search for the persuasion book started. So working with him through the Aristotle book was really great. We did a second project together. A year went by. I had done a dozen of these projects. And then my wife said, you should really write this down. You've done a good job of explaining this sort of obscure text and updating it for a modern audience. I said, no, I didn't think I had that much to say about it. She said, "We'll put together an outline." I did. I sent it to an agent, and the agent said, "If you write it, I'll sell it." I wrote it. He sold it, and 3 years later, the book was released last fall in 23, and it's been fun talking about the book ever since.
Yeah, fascinating journey. You mentioned speaking, and I love the metaphor, by the way, the classical musician versus the jazz musician, because I can relate to that. The thing that I'm curious about is, well, first of all, how do you define persuasion in
Yeah.
in a context like that? And it may be public speaking, it may be a presentation that we're doing, it may be a marketing or sales pitch that we're doing, it may be a pitch to investors to fund the business. So all of those are, for me, kind of public speaking, and we need to get people to agree to do something that we're asking them to do. So define persuasion in those kind of contexts for us.
Yeah, and I define it for all contexts, right? Because one of the things that when I coach people, and I've done almost 40 coaching projects with CV startup founders, CEOs, leaders of nonprofits, and my first question is always, finish this sentence. Persuasion is ... And I've never had anyone answer with much confidence, right? They're always kind of, well, it's maybe this, maybe that. And I say, look, it's the reason I ask the question is that it's very hard to be good at something we can't define.
Yeah.
So let's start with the definition. And I'm going to use models, which is persuasion is a demonstration that something is true or seems to be true. Full stop. That's it. It's a very simple statement, but it has many and some profound implications. First one being that I don't persuade you, truth does. So my job isn't to change your mind or to agree with something. My job is to get you to believe that something is true or seems to be true. Unless you're irrational, he says, persuasion follows by necessity. And I agree with that statement. And so, I always emphasize this issue, right? Persuasion is just a demonstration that something is true. That's the definition. In all contexts, in all settings, in all places and forms, that's the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting, and listening to some of your book, particularly the quotes, going back to the work of Aristotle, that came through very strongly on that. And one of the things I reflect on and I'm curious about is that one person's truth is not the same as another person's truth. And, we're seeing that in spades these days in social media where, and we'll come back to this, I guess, in a little bit, where persuasion perhaps is being used for good and bad. I guess the idea is, the classical one for me, two people go to a sports game together and they follow the two opposing sides who are competing. And the truth for each of those people is very different, right? If there's a controversial decision made by the umpire or referee, those two people will see it in a completely different light and their truth may be completely different. So
Well, and neither persuade the other unless one gets the other one to accept his or her truth as the truth.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge, that we may start with two different opinions about what is true. And therein lies the challenge. I must get you to agree that what I believe is true is in fact true if you don't believe that to start with. Or if you have no opinion on the subject, I just have to get you to accept that what I claim is correct. Right. So we may start from that point, but great communicators have a skill for getting you to believe what they want you to believe. And that's the essence of this, right? That truth is the essential part. And oftentimes when I coach people, I'll ask them, what is the fundamental truth that you want the person to accept? And they've never thought about this,
Mm.
right? They're creating messages and putting other things in place. And I go, well, let's just take a step back, right? And so the book makes this argument because Aristotle says in his book, the great insight, right, which is many people have heard before. I'm not the first one to share it. Is that only three things persuade? There is the character of the communicator, be it a person, a school, a government, whatever it is, right? A sports fan. there,
Mm.
there are arguments presented, logic, proofs, evidence, witnesses, whatever. And then there's the emotion that the audience feels. And so in the book, I say, if we think about, well, the thing about Aristotle is this, now that I think about it, is that he is kind of a weird guy in the sense that the more obvious something is, the less he explains it.
Yeah.
And it's obvious to him that he doesn't really go beyond just making the statement. And the words you often hear are ethos, pathos, logos, right? So character, emotion, and logic or argument. I use the English terms because they're easier for me. And the other thing about Aristotle is this book, The Rhetoric, was not a book. It was a notebook. It's teaching notes, as far
Mm.
as we can tell. It's not a treatise that was to be published, what we think of it today conceptually as a codex or a book with a beginning and an end. So it's a lot of different ideas. And my book tries to answer two questions. One, first one is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by character, argument, and emotion? And the second one is, what exactly is persuasion? If I'm persuaded, at the most basic level, what is happening? And so I'll explain a little bit the thesis of the book, which is that I argue in the book that there are 7 parts of character. There are 7 pieces of argument, right? 7 elements, I call them. And then there are 7 kinds of emotion. When I lay these out, I was left with 21 things that are the things that make up messages. And I was looking for a metaphor to simplify the 21 things. And I thought, high school chemistry class, it's kind of like a periodic table. And so we build messages from these elements in different combinations. And I always joke that I've studied thousands of messages, people to gods to gods, gods to people. And every message I've ever looked at is some combination of these 21 things.
Mm.
And so persuasion becomes chemistry with language. And that's the way I think of it. I think it's chemistry, which means it has rules, hence the title. It's predictable, and it works in ways that can be learned and even mastered.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the one of the things I find fascinating, apart from the metaphor, because as a trained chemist, that that resonates with me. The what I found fascinating was looking at this in sort of the wholeness of the whole communication spectrum, because commonly I think people in communication focus on the logical side of the argument. And so they say, but look at this. Here's some evidence,
Mm-hmm.
and and a lot of the evidence might be circumstantial evidence, and that proves that what I'm saying is true.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they haven't tapped into the emotional connection. And I guess the sports metaphor is a really good one because there's an emotional connection between each fan and their club that they follow. They haven't tapped in to the character part as well. So some people might quote, "Hey, there's a famous person that said this is true, so therefore it must be true." So that, I guess, that's the character, but it's more than that, isn't it? It's kind of the personal character, and how do you establish that?
Right, because that actually is a very old idea. It's called a call to authority
Hmm.
when you part of argument. And so character refers to who is talking to me, what is talking to me. And it's a funny thing that when I coach people, and usually the very successful business people, physicians, scientists, professor types, what I find is always the same so far, which is, imagine persuasion is a ship with 3 masts, but only one sail is open. And that sail is called argument. The character sail, it looks like it's brand new. It's never been used. right? And then emotion is also tight, right? And what happens? Somewhere on the line, they were told you shouldn't be part of the story, and they either tried to work with emotion and couldn't do it, right? Or have never even tried. And so I tell them, all we're going to do is we're going to open the character cell, we're going to open the emotion cell, and we're going to lower the argument cell, right? It's going to do less work. The boat's going to go faster and farther. And you'll be surprised at how much faster and farther we'll go. And all we're doing is just letting the other things that you have at your disposal, right, also help move the ship forward. And there are just countless examples of small things that we've changed that suddenly, to your point, now the force begins to arise and the person becomes a more persuasive communicator, and everything they needed was already there. They just hadn't opened. Right.
So, what are some of the things to think about if we find ourselves in that kind of situation? And I'd say that a lot of us fall into that. I know I certainly do a lot of the time. What sort of things should we be thinking about? What sort of questions should we be asking ourselves to raise those other sails and perhaps make the
Absolutely.
logic one do less work?
The first one is, what about you makes me want to believe you? Right. So we take these 7 elements of character, things like associations, categories, history, status. The most important one is origin, in my opinion, which is referred to, where does your character come from? Where was it formed? Right. And the more elite and or tribal your audience, the more they care about origin.
Yeah.
When you hear somebody say, "What did you go to school? What did you train?" These kinds of things, right? Well, we have this innate thing that we believe that someone's character, where it comes from, matters. So find something about the origin of your character, learn how to describe it, learn how to share it, and then suddenly that becomes a force working on your behalf. On the other end, I ask people when they come in, I get a lot of sort of pitch deck kind of requests, right? Or startup kind of things where somebody's pitching a startup, and I'll ask them, I'll listen to the pitch deck or to the presentation, and I'll say, what emotion do you want me to feel right now? You finished. What did you want me to feel during the presentation? But especially now, you stopped. Your last slide is over. What emotion do you want me to feel? And they haven't thought of it. And I said, well, I'm going to feel something. So if you're not in control, then you're leaving it up to chance. And a great communicator leaves nothing up to chance, at least not to the much that you can't. So let's just think about that question. What do you want me to feel? Excited, hopeful, interested, inspired? What is it? And once you decide what it is, let's build that. Let's make the chemistry created. So just those 2 things. Find one thing in your personal character or history or origin that makes me want to believe you, and then think about what you want me to feel. Just doing those 2 things can radically, and I mean radically, change the force that you bring to a conversation or to a speech or to a presentation. And it's remarkable how easy it is and yet how often it's overlooked.
Yeah, that's great advice. Now, the one thing that came up for me as you were describing that, particularly on the emotion side, is the nuances of emotion. So I
Mhm.
know there's, and I can't remember who put this together first, but there's this emotional wheel with a whole lot of colors, and I refer to that a lot when I'm putting together speeches and things because I struggle to nuance that. I say, well, I want you to feel excited, or I want you to feel really enthusiastic, or I want you to feel touched. But I've sort of got a limited vocabulary around that. And so, how do you deal with that kind of challenge?
I start with these 7 broad categories of emotion. For example, positive, right? Negative, and uh, contemplative, emotions that slow the brain down. Nostalgia, for example. There are emotions that are mystical, things you feel but can't explain, like in sports, for example. Being there when somebody wins the World Cup, and you for the rest of your life remember that moment. You can't put your finger on what it was, but it was special. There are religious emotions, which are emotions that are designed to complement religious experience, right? So the question becomes, And for the ancients, by the way, they were obsessed with this. They wrote treatise
Hmm.
after treatise, 6 kinds of anger, 5 kinds of envy,
Yeah,
four
yeah.
types of jealousy. It became kind of crazy. I don't think you need to do that. I think you just ask a simple question within these seven, which one do I want? And then say, learn how it operates. And Aristotle says to work with an emotion, you must know 3 things about it. One, how is it generated? 2, how does it behave? And 3, what is its effect on an audience? Right. And so think about what you want and then learn to generate it. Again, go back to chemistry, right? When you're a chemist,
Yeah.
you start basic formulas when you're in college, and then you do more complex things later. Well, learn how to make some basic formulations, and then when it works, you make it better, or you add a second one or a third one until you begin to get a sense of how all these things work. And I'll give you a good example, and that's inspiration. Right? So, word you hear all the time in business, especially.
Hmm.
Well, what does it mean to inspire someone? Well, I argue in the book that inspiration is the creation of desire. So what inspiration it creates in you a longing for something. You are persuaded that you are missing something by inspiring you. And in fact, if we think about it in the romantic sense, there you are, a young person walking around, life is grand, and then you meet this certain someone. And from that day on, you can't sleep. You are now convinced that your life is incomplete without this person. And so you have been inspired, right, to love. And now you're missing something. In fact, in the movie Jerry Maguire, as a sports movie, right? What does Tom Cruise says at the end? He says, "You complete me." Right? Without her, missing something. So, okay, then what do I want to persuade you that you don't have? Okay, how do I do that? Oh, yeah, okay. Now let me do that. Now you're in control of the emotion, right? Called inspiration. And now you can inspire.
Hmm.
People use words sometimes without thinking what they really are.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to go inspire the team. Well, do you know what inspiration is? And do you know how to create it? No, then you're probably not going to do that. And that's when you see these sort of fake emotions all the time, right? Especially on LinkedIn, right? Which
Hmm.
I always say is the museum of bad persuasion. Where I'm super excited to be at this training. You go, no, you're not, right?
Hey.
You're not. I know you're not. So let's just move on, right? So better to use none than to use fake emotion, which is called
Hmm.
sentimentality, because that actually does damage. At least if you don't even try, you're not going to do anybody any wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's so funny. A museum of
Bad
bad
persuasion.
persuasion. Yeah. Um,
Right.
you did touch on something there that I did want to move on to. I don't know whether we might circle back to the positive side again, but there's so many examples in history of the dark side of persuasion, and I
Yeah.
guess uh, just in listening to what you've said and in reading parts of your book. Um, it kind of occurred to me that a lot of these people that, like, you know, infamous dictators, and you quote the example of Idi Amin right at the beginning of your book, but these
Mhm.
infamous dictators that kind of inflicted all kinds of harm on millions of people were master persuaders, and
Yeah.
yet they used those skills to manipulate people into doing evil and to do evil themselves. What First of all, do you think they've worked on their persuasion skills, or is it something that for some people comes naturally? And secondly, talk to us a little bit more about the other side of that coin. So, as individuals, how can we see, how can we recognize when somebody's trying to persuade for evil intent?
Right. So we go back to the metaphor of chemistry, right? And as I say in the book, chemistry is amoral.
Hmm.
You know much more about this topic than I do, but I know, like I do, that um, I can save your life with chemistry, or I can take it.
Hmm.
And so the same thing happens with the chemistry of language. I can save a nation, or I can destroy it. And you're right. There have been people in history who either by nature or by nurture, talent or hard work, or in many cases both, became masterful persuaders. And they took that power and used it to corrupt, right? To destroy and to commit the greatest crimes in history. Um, the example I examine in the book is the Nazi regime. There were others I considered
Mm.
talking about, but that one because people sort of know what it is, right? Generally speaking, and in the chapter I outline what I call markers, linguistic markers. And I use as my guide a book called The Language of the Third Reich, written by Victor Klemperer, who was a linguist who survived the war and published a book in 1947 called The Language of the Third Reich. And I take examples that he describes and I label them and I categorize them. And I say, I picked 9 out of many I could have picked because all 9 are present in American contemporary social and political discourse. And as I describe them, hopefully, if you understand them and then you see it, you recognize it for what it is,
Mm.
right? It is a tool of corrupt persuasion. And as I say in that chapter, I think the 9th thing I mention is the ultimate aim of corrupt persuasion is the death of persuasion. What does that mean? It means that I want to get to the point where I don't need to persuade you anymore.
Mm.
You just act. And in certain moments of history, people have gotten to that point where they didn't even need to be persuaded anymore, right? I had so corrupted your body, your defense mechanism was so weakened, right? That I say the word and you do whatever I tell you to do. You don't even need to be persuaded anymore.
Yeah.
And that's their goal. And so I think that that's the key thing is to be aware of how these things work, that they are working. And look, this used to be a topic everyone learned. You couldn't be an educated person without having studied this. After World War II, slowly over a period of
Mm.
decades, it came out of the curriculum. And I explain why in the book. The problem is, as I note, that just because you don't teach chemistry doesn't mean it stops working,
Yeah.
right? And so the chemistry continued, the learning about it stopped.
Mm.
And there's
Mm. Yes, yeah, it's a great metaphor on so many levels because chemistry. I mean, there's a lot of people. I remember laughing when I was first studying chemistry, and if I told people I'm studying chemistry, and this was in the very first wave of um, environmental consciousness coming up, and if I told people I studied chemistry, they it's really bad, and I had to laugh because a lot of the reports that were in the news were these very attractive female reporters would stand up there sprouting how bad chemistry was. But
mm,
because this woman was very attractive, she had heavy makeup on, she had big, thick lipstick, big, thick mascara. And I kept thinking, what's in all that stuff that you're wearing? And it's
yeah.
kind of, yeah, it's the two things, isn't it?
And also imagine that we didn't study chemistry, but you knew chemistry
Yeah,
and you showed people things. Wouldn't you seem like magic,
yeah,
right? Could I'm sure as a chemist, I'm sure there are things you could do in
yeah,
front of me when people say, and I would go, "You have a superpower,"
yeah.
and all you no, I just have the last chemistry textbook on earth, so I know how this stuff works. And in a way, that's kind of what this is. I when I coach people, I'll tell them to make a change in something that they say, and then they instantly everything is transformed. They think, "How did you do that?" And I go, you would never ask a chemist how because the chemist knows chemistry.
Hmm.
I just happen to know chemistry, so I can tell you exactly how this is going to work. And I think that's the key thing that when it falls to the wrong hands, it has the same power, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
diminish just the way someone who gets hold of a dirty bomb or some sort of chemical thing that can destroy a city, right? It's still very powerful just because
Hmm.
it's in the wrong people's hands. In some
Yeah.
ways, it's even more dangerous. So I
Well,
think that's the key
it's
thing.
even more subtle than that because what I was thinking of as you were describing that metaphor in the case of kind of use for evil was like electric vehicles or electric bicycles, and there's lots of examples where houses have burned down because people have left their chargers on overnight and the battery catches fire, which that's chemistry.
Right?
Uh,
It happens,
yeah,
right?
but it's
So,
also chemistry that drives the vehicle.
and I'll give you an example. I'll mention only one from that chapter because it's an interesting one. And so it's something I call language blurring, right? So this is language blurring. Uh, You and I are driving through a forest in a car, and Out of the corner of your eye, you see a shiny thing. And you say, "Would you see that?" And I go, "Yeah." You go, "What was it?" And I say, "It was a man playing the trombone." And we keep driving. A few minutes later, same thing. You go, "What was that?" And I go, "It was a man playing a trumpet." Happens one more time. I go, "It's a man playing saxophone." The fourth time, you won't ask what it was. And I persuaded you there's a brass band in the forest.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So Klemperer says in the Third Reich, there was a constant drone of messages. He says the thing that was the most effective wasn't the big lie, quote unquote. It was the sound we heard but didn't listen to. Speeches like Hitler or Goebbels or Goering, right? It was 24 hours a day. Nobody paid attention, but it was seeping into our consciousness. And so when you have someone, for example, who claims to hate something, hate an idea, hate a person, but can't tell you why, they're often a victim of language blurring. They subconsciously absorb the idea. And in America, this is very common. I hate idea X. All right, this person is terrible. And then you go, well, can you describe idea X? No, but you hate it. Yes. And you're sure it's evil. Yes, but you don't know what it is. Yes. Why? Because I've been hearing from commentator A, B, or C for 5 years that this is a terrible thing. Well, that's language blurring, right? It's a very sophisticated technique. A very simple one is called term linking. So term linking is when I connect words together. And Klemperer says you couldn't just be, first I was Klemperer, then I became the Jew Klemperer. Then I became the corrupt Jew Klemperer. Then I became the blank, blank, blank Jew Klemperer. It was like a train that kept being built, right? And so this connecting of terms that don't go together is a very suspicious thing. So, for example, in America, you'll hear, right, liberal this, fascist that, right, un-American this, socialist that. And immediately my alarm is up because I go, this is the most basic of things. When you start appending words together, hoping I don't notice, right, that's term linking. It's a very basic technique, but it has its effect. So again, once you see it, you realize, okay, I know what this is. And it's even a very sophisticated one, like blurring is, which is a much different thing. Yeah. So that is the chemistry of these things, right, and how they work. And I hope that in the book, I think of it as a kind of inoculation in a way, or like a vaccine, that if you read that one chapter, that hopefully it makes you better equipped that your body's rhetorical defense mechanism is strengthened by that text.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that raises, of course, is how today's digital and social media play a role in all of this, because a lot of those techniques, whether they're good or bad, can be magnified by social media in particular, because we can reach so many more people, or we don't have to have that platform of being a political leader, for example, that gets to make a speech in front of thousands of people and can then deliver a message that, whether it's good or bad, we have that platform. Every one of us has that platform at our fingertips on our smartphones or on a computer. So how does the whole kind of rise of digital media and social media impact this?
It's a very good question. And in fact, there's a chapter in the book about persuasion and technology that includes certain media like television, for example, which I look at video, but then also social media platforms. And I think I look at Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Wikipedia, which is a social platform, just isn't a social media platform. And what happens on these platforms is that there tends to be a dominant persuasion logic that takes over and rewards certain behavior and certain content. For example, on X/Twitter, it's argument. It was originally powered to fame by journalists, and most journalists are on X, right? And so what happens? The way in which you gain currency is you pick a fight with somebody more famous than you, hoping that person will respond. If they do, you then move up and get to fight with some. It's like boxing, right? And then the ability to fight with ever more powerful opponents raises you to the top of the charts on that platform. YouTube is about character. YouTube, if you listen to YouTube people and you observe the platform, how it works, people who are very popular make tons of videos, hundreds, sometimes, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of videos.
Hmm.
Know what video is going to make or break your channel, usually. What you want to do is you want to build likability. You want to build a relationship with the audience. They like you because you make videos about this or how you make the video. So it's a very personal thing.
Hmm.
Instagram, because it was images as its core persuasion logic, was about emotion.
Hmm.
Images aren't good for logic, but they are good for emotion. And so the majority of content on Instagram was sentimental. And this is a real issue because one thing that's happened to this generation is that it's been over sentimentalized. Right. And it's one of the things I talk about in chapter 9, because Klemperer says, whenever you see excessive sentimentality in a regime, be nervous.
Yeah.
And and this generation has been desensitized to sentimentality because they've been bombarded with it. Right. Everything from social signaling, virtual signaling, these kinds of things. And so they're almost kind of numb to it at this point, to the point that I wonder if they could recognize real emotion when they see it.
Hmm.
Older, you dealt with different kinds of effects, right? So yeah, to your point, the sheer quantity is an issue. But the other issue I talk about is what I call persuasion factories. And that is, I can take today a message. Let's say I decided I don't like you, and I want the world to agree that you shouldn't be liked. Well, in the old days, I'd have to walk around with a sign saying Jurgen is a bad, don't like Jurgen. It doesn't work that way anymore. What I do now is I go to a platform. The company, one of the companies does it, is here in DC, and I give them my macro message.
Hmm.
They then, with some parameters of what I will allow you to not say or not say, they then bid it out. They publish it. And micro influencers, people who have 100 people, 500 people, 1,000, 3,000, they'll say, I will get a follower to dislike Jurgen for $2.
Hmm.
That's my offer. And so I'll pay you $1. We'll settle at 150. Now that person goes to work to tell his 1,200 people not to like you, and so on and so forth, right? So I now have a factory in a few weeks of 2 or 300 or 2 or 3,000 micro persuaders who are doing my work for me.
Hmm.
Uh, and this is done by humans, so done by machines. So the power I have to put, again, the corrupt versions is to work is just so much higher because of social media and because of technology.
Hmm.
You had an emperor 2,000 years ago to have the kind of persuasive reach that the average person has today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's pretty scary. I didn't know there was stuff like that around. Well, let's turn it
Mhm.
back around again. How, given that we have this power in the social media, and we have this influence potentially that you needed to be an emperor a couple of thousand years ago. How can we use this for good?
Right. So now we go back to what I hope is the other. There are 10 chapters. Only one is about some
Hmm.
nice thing. The rest are about. I assume if you buy my book, you're a good person, and that you're doing it for the right
Well,
things.
that's a
That's
truth,
my
right?
truth, right? So yes, then the issue becomes, what are the truths that I want people to believe, and how do I harness this linguistic rhetorical power on my behalf? And it's not that hard, really. It's like practice, right? If you're a musician, the first time you play scales, it seems like an unnatural act.
Hmm.
Your hands weren't designed to move the way they do. A few years later, you can talk to someone and play the scale without even thinking about it. And the same thing happens here. It's a little bit awkward at first, but in a short while, you go ask yourself, why didn't I do this the whole time? So it's about, again, back to these simple things. Look at the table and ask the question, which element feels comfortable to me? And let me get good at that. And then if I need more, I add a second, right? In chemistry, there's a whole year-long class on one element, carbon,
Yeah.
right? So likewise, origin. Origin, you could work your whole life probably just in origin if you got really good at it, right? If you were good at inspiring people, as people are, that's all you need
Hmm.
to be huge impact. So no one says you have to master them all. I think you learn a few, get good at them, and then use those powers you have for the right things, to persuade people of things that are true and right. And hopefully the book will do more good than harm in that sense. It'll create more positive persuaders or communicators than the opposite. That's my
Hmm.
hope anyway. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I certainly hope that that is the case. Although I'm always conscious of how can we. You used the word inoculate before, and I think that's a really good one. How can we inoculate against those triggers that people use in these communication or these persuasion skills that
Right.
um, show that they're likely being or have evil motivations, and
And I
how can
think,
we question them?
yeah, people sometimes ask me, what's the relationship between your book and a book like Cialdini's book on influence, classic
Hmm,
kind of in this field? I say, look, we had medicine long before chemistry,
hmm,
thousands of years before. Actually, we knew this plant cures this rash. We didn't know why. It was a long time later that people came along and said, well, because this molecule binds with that molecule, and so on and so forth. And I think of those books as medicine, and I think of my book as chemistry,
hmm,
right? It explains why that was an interesting book on influence, or why that other book was good, or why that sales class was effective, right? This is one step back. So I think those kinds of communication professionals are great doctors, but they're not chemists, right? There aren't many persuasion chemists. And
yeah,
so, hopefully, in my case, the idea is to teach you the chemistry. Now, why is that important? And here's why I say it's important. Maybe it's the most fundamental point I make in the book. And that is, persuasion to me is not about closing a deal or winning an argument, or getting elected. Persuasion to me goes something like this, right? Let's say I love Jaws, the movie Jaws.
hmm,
I love Roy Schneider. I love the shark. I love the boat. I know every line. I have a copy of the script at home that's been bound. I love Jaws. And then I'm at an airport somewhere. My flight gets delayed. I'm stuck there, and you're sitting next to me, and I see you watching Jaws on your computer. And then we start talking about Jaws. Turns out you love Jaws even more than I do, right? You met Spielberg at a Jaws convention. That instant when we share our love of Jaws, or we and I are bonded,
hmm,
we become a community, right? We have an innate need that people love what we love, that people praise what we praise, that they uh, dislike what we dislike. And so persuasion is about community.
hmm,
It's about being united to your audience in the love of something or in the belief of something. And that's just about as fundamental a human
hmm,
need as I can think of, right? I don't want to be alone. And we don't want to be alone. And the moment I convince you of something or you convince me of something, we have a little
hmm.
bond just created, right? And I think that's what this book is about. It's
Yeah,
about
yeah. That's the
this trait.
hmm. It's human connection, isn't it?
I
Which
think
is
so.
yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. It's a great point because one of the things I was curious about was, how does all of this reflect back on human nature? And I think you've encapsulated that really well there. And great example. I'm not a huge fan of Jaws, by the way, but
I am. So
yeah,
I'll persuade you one day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I have seen the movies. It's good.
I yours.
All right. Well, I think this is a great point, great time to move on to the buzz, which is our innovation round. It's the same 5 questions that I ask of every guest. And the idea is you'll give us an inspiring, dare I say the word,
Okay.
answer that will trigger some action on behalf of our listener today. Are you all
Okay.
set?
Happy.
Excellent. What's the number one thing anyone needs to do to be more innovative?
Learn to see things from different perspectives. It's very easy to be locked into a point of view, a lens, as we call it in scholarship.
Hmm.
So learn to work with different lens. If the only lens you have is 50 millimeter,
Yeah.
everything kind of looks. learn a 75, a 200, a zoom, a Y,
Yeah.
right? So get good at seeing things from different points of view.
I love the photography metaphor. I went out for a walk on Saturday, and just as an interesting exercise, I set my camera to black and white, a digital camera, set it to black and white so that everything would show up inside the camera on black and white. And I took a series of black and white photos and then came back, and I was really impressed with the black and white photos. But when I posted them, I made the comment that learning to see things in a different way, because you actually do have to see things in a different way to capture really good black and white shots, because you're ignoring the color, you're ignoring some of the contrast. And yeah, so it's a great metaphor. All right, what's the best thing you've done to develop new ideas?
Uh, learn something new.
Yeah.
I always play the piano, and I tried guitar and it didn't work. And then 10 years ago, I said, okay, I'm going to try piano, and I won't stop for 5 years. I'll give myself some time,
Mm-hmm.
and did learn how to play. And a few years earlier, I learned French. Every year, I pick a different topic, and I read only about that topic for fun, right? So one year it was math, one year it's optics, one year it was the American West. So the pushing myself to learn something new, even if I don't see why at the beginning, I just think it's kind of important to know about this topic, has been, for me personally, the most generative thing when it comes to being creative or to thinking about things in a different way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? First of all, I think it kind of fuels that non-stop learning desire that
Mm.
I think most of us have. I certainly have it. I think it's innate in everybody. And the second thing, you've used a lot of metaphors today that are kind of in completely different areas related to persuasion and communication. And so I think that gives us ideas studying things that are not necessarily related to what we do on a day-to-day basis that actually transition over.
Yeah, and I think people who are, and I know people who I've known who are very smart, have this amazing gift of metaphor, of saying, well, this is kind of like that. And you
Mm.
go, well, you're right. And suddenly the thing is seen in a different light or
Yeah.
understood in a different way. And that's what uh, really great educators, right, and thinkers do. They open up a different way of seeing something which you've seen before, and now you see it through their eyes, and suddenly you move forward in your
Mm.
understanding of that thing.
Mm. And I think it's a persuasion mechanism too, isn't it? That,
Absolutely.
yeah,
If I
I
get you to,
guess,
yeah, this is the essence of the. Remember, I said I had two questions in the book. The second was, what is persuade? What is actually is it? And it's a word called vividness. It's Aristotle's word. I bring the truth to life.
mm,
If I can do that through the chemistry, if it's enough energy is released that the idea becomes vivid in your mind and you see it, then that's when you're persuaded. And
mm,
I think that's what that does, right? It makes something visible to us, and then we believe it.
mm. Excellent. All right. Do you have a favorite resource you use most often?
It's certainly books for me. I'm a book person, so in fact, I'm taking one of my PhD classes is on the book, but the book as an object, not
Hmm.
as text. Right? And so had this wonderful experience of seeing what I call artist books. So artist books are books that are not really about the text so much, but about the object itself.
Yeah.
So I find going to the library for me. And in America, we're very privileged because, like a lot of other places, libraries often have special collections. And it's a wonderful thing that the libraries will show you the most remarkable thing if you just ask nicely. I
Mm,
was at the Johns Hopkins Library recently because I found out that they have this thing called the Freeman Collection, which is the world's greatest collection of forgeries, of
mm,
forged manuscripts and documents. And I love forgeries as a topic. So I just wrote them an email, say, can I come to the Freeman collection and seize this stuff? And they, yeah, sure. When would you like to come? And they gave me a table and they brought out boxes and I was allowed to handle things that were hundreds of years old, right?
no,
And touch and see it, and it was just this remarkable thing. So I've been on this library tour this year of going to Princeton, of going to Hopkins here on the East Coast in America, and I'm just amazed that somebody will just hand you a box of things that are 500 years old, irreplaceable, and say, call me when you're finished.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, libraries, absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Book
Yeah.
collection, any kind.
That's
Mhm.
pretty amazing. Yeah.
Mhm.
And I'm sure even though they're forgeries, there's a certain aura to these things, I guess.
Well, they're remarkable in their relation to the real thing. And one of my favorite ones is there was a Scottish gentleman who I guess he was a kind of struggling poet. Which, by the way, for some reason, poets are really into forgeries. I don't know why. It's a name like the top poet. Can't remember. But anyway, he's a poet. So he makes up the story that he had gone to the Outer Hebrides, these remote islands in Scotland, and discovered these medieval Celtic texts. And people love them, and they sell well.
Hmm.
So on one of the trips, he discovers a 19,000 line epic poem. Right? I think it's the Epic of Ossian, or the Tale of Ossian, and the thing goes viral at that time. It
Yeah.
becomes famous. It's Thomas Jefferson had a copy, right? So it just becomes this great work of medieval, Celtic literature. Eventually, people figure out that it's not real,
Hmm.
and it's debunked, right? And it's said to be fake. But I kept wondering about, what about those 2 years?
Hmm.
People love this, right? It should have been real. It would have been nice if it was real.
Yeah.
So this relationship of, if the painting you love is a fake, but you still love the painting, then what's the difference,
Hmm.
right? If you get pleasure from looking at this, I love Jackson Pollock and Rothko, modern artists, or not modern anymore, but mid 20th century
Hmm.
artists. And if I had a fake Rothko and it looked like a real one, I'm pretty sure I would enjoy it as much as the real Rothko.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the relationship of the object to the audience, right? And what's real and what isn't, and even if it's fake, can it still be great?
Hmm.
I think interesting question.
Yeah, yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It's probably a whole topic of another podcast. Yeah, and I mean, I imagine that the story or the poem, the epic that was written, that he wrote it himself. Then, so it
Right.
was it was something that he produced, and if it kind of took off, did it take off because people believed it was this 1,000-year-old Celtic tale, or did they enjoy how it made them feel when they read it? Yeah,
Mhm.
and which
And-
comes back to your point is do you get the enjoyment from the material, or simply from the fact that it's this rather than it's this that it was claimed to be rather than a forgery?
It is, and it's a fascinating topic because there are people who buy books for the binding, right? And by the way, I learned in this class that for the longest time, books were stacked spine inward, so you would see the pages, and they would write the title on the pages, and so a lot of
Okay.
times they were so it was common for a long time that you would buy the what I call the gatherings, the actual pages, and then you would have them bound. And
Hmm.
so you had a family binder,
All right.
and all your books, or they would have your coat of arms, or all your history books were red, or your literature was blue, whatever it was, right? And so this question of people who love the book as an object, not the text itself, is another interesting question, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, this is a topic where we could talk all night long about the relationship of the book, the object, the text, real, not real, real paintings, fake paintings,
Yeah, yeah.
right? I'm fascinated by these questions of art and in all its forms.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting, and I mean, well, we talked a little bit about photography. There's a lot there as well, and I think the lines are even blurrier there. Hmm.
Mhm.
All right, now what's the best way to keep a client on track?
To keep a client on track,
Yeah.
a great question, because I used to always tell my consulting teams that any client decision has a half life of 2 weeks. which means that, and that assumes that everyone actually agreed to it at the
Yeah.
time that the clock's ticking. Because when I became a consulting senior manager and then partner, my job was holding opinion in place. Because what happens is we have a steering committee meeting, and as any consultant knows, within 48 hours, something will be said, read, seen, encountered that will push on that decision.
Hmm.
Something. So I just had to hold everything together until the next steering committee meeting and remind people, hey, we made this decision, right, because of these reasons. And so I guess the best way was to understand how fragile consensus is or decisions are as a consultant, and to that the senior person's job is to, at least for me, was make sure the team can do its job, number one, and two, keep the environment in which they work intact, which was almost always about decision making. Right, this is how we're going to handle this, so let's stay with that approach and not change things. I'd say the other thing is, it's very in the beginning of any kind of project master consulting, which was I would always talk to clients about and say, I'm going to give you a choice. You can elect me on the first day of the project or the last, but not both. So I can't be like at the first month, or I say first month or the last month,
Hmm.
right? If you like me in the first month, it's because I'm not pushing your people or I'm not holding them accountable. And when they start complaining that this is supposed to happen and it didn't, you're not going to be happy, but that's okay. Trust me that when we're in the last month and we're ahead of schedule, under budget, project worked well, it's a year later, everybody's happy, you'll be glad that you disliked me in the first month so you can the last. So it's rare that, not that it didn't happen. Once in a while, you get one where it was like it was all good for the whole project, but
Yeah.
more often than not, you could have one or the other, but not
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Gives you some leeway to push really hard at the beginning too.
Right, it's exactly right. This again, you're gonna like me on the last month,
Yeah.
right? With the project, and like put it in the project plan, like Carlos, right? The project, right? Just start for a while.
Yeah, excellent. All right. Well, final question of the buzz round. What's the number one thing anyone can do to differentiate themselves?
Become an expert in something. And I would tell my team, my consultants at the time, an expert, a Renaissance person is someone who transcends a specialty, not lacks one.
Hmm.
So find your basis for being in the room, right? Why are you here? Get very good at one thing, right? Become a master at something. And then if you're fortunate, transcend it, right? Be a technologist who transcends and moves into strategy. Be a strategist who transcends strategy and understands technology, right? Be an operations person who transcends that and understands marketing, or vice versa. So, to me, that's the basic thing. Find the thing that is the reason why you're in this room,
Hmm.
and then if you're lucky and work hard enough, transcend it later,
Yeah.
not at the beginning.
Not at the
Right? At
beginning.
the
Yeah.
beginning, right? Find your chair
Yeah.
and earn that chair. Right.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. Because I think a lot of people kind of ignore the basis and they try to become a generalist and ignore that there's got to be a core somewhere.
You're exactly right.
Hmm.
And this is the point, right? You hear that word all the time, generalist, and I go, well, okay, well, what does that really mean? If I'm making an airplane, I don't hire generalists,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I hire there's the metals engineer, there's the structure engineer, the materials person, right? If you watch Apollo 13 and they're launching that rocket or whatever, right? One's the guidance, one's this, one's the health, etc., fuel. There's no, hey, generalist, are we ready to launch?
Yeah. Yeah.
None of that. So now the generalist is the person who transcended that and is now running the show, right?
Hmm.
And but that person had one of those roles, and I think that's the interesting part. At least for me, for people I've worked with, is and I've seen it again and again that the people who I work with went on to I was lucky that people who worked for me went on to become CEOs and professors and have had great success. And I always follow their career. And I see that going back, thinking back, that they were the ones who worked really hard when they were consultants or they were more junior to have that foundational identity,
Mm.
right? And then went on to become venture partners, right? Or CEOs or founders or other kinds of really phenomenal roles. But in the beginning, they weren't interested in being journalists.
Mm.
They were interested in being really good at something.
Yeah. Yeah. Become really good. Mm.
Right.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Carlos. This has been fabulous. Now, where can people find out more about you? Maybe get a hold of the book and also reach out and say thanks for what you've shared with us today.
Well, first of all, I am on the Museum of Bad Persuasion, so I am on LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. Uh, a better place is on my author site, so carlosalvarenga.com, just my name.com,
Mm.
and you can find out about past publications, persuasion, future publications. Also, I write a newsletter on culture, on art, culture. It's a critical newsletter called The Critic at Large, which you can find from the website. It's on Substack, and then also you can send me a message. So if you read the book or think it's crazy or whatever it is you want to talk about it,
Yeah.
you can
I want
you
to
can send me a message.
persuade you to redact something.
Exactly. And so you can contact me through the website, and I always respond to people who send me notes.
Excellent. All right. And we'll, of course, include links to all of those places in the show notes. So, as we wrap it up, what action would you like our listener to take out of our conversation today, Carlos?
It's an emotional one. I practice what I preach. The emotion I want to generate, and I hope I generated tonight, was curiosity.
Hmm.
Want to know more, and you want to go find out if I'm right or not, because I think I am. And
Yeah.
if I inspired inspired you, as in made you believe that you lack this knowledge, and or made you curious to say maybe I do, let me go find out more, then I hope you'll check out the book.
Excellent. Great call to action. Yeah. And there's plenty of material on the website where people can find out more about the book and decide whether they want to take the next step. So thanks so much for sharing your time and your insights with us so generously today, Carlos. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've kind of delved into a couple of areas that probably make other podcast episodes, some sort of fascinating ones that are probably a little bit left field compared to some compared to the theme we have here, but they touch on some of my areas of passion like chemistry and photography, and also we've touched on books and films. I mean, there's lots of other films. I'm not necessarily a fan of Jaws, but there's lots of films that I am a fan of, and I'm sure we can find some that we have in common.
I have no doubt that we would. Jürgen. Listen, thank you so much. I'm always deeply grateful of anyone who gives a writer a time to talk about work and or an ideas person about ideas. So thank you for having me on, and thank you to your audience for listening. It's been a pleasure to be here.